I was a little nervous on the operating table, so I wanted to chat to ease the atmosphere. Dr. Joe, what do you do? The doctor who was about to operate on me was stunned for a moment, but still answered me politely. Doctor. The atmosphere in the operating room suddenly became awkward and solidified, and the nurses next to me were trying to hold back their laughter. Forget it, a lifetime will pass quickly. I closed my eyes and waited for the anesthetic to take effect. Before I completely lost consciousness, the last thought in my head was, how could there be such a handsome doctor in the world? Our meeting should be a date and roses, not appendix. At this time, I didn't know how terrible the consequences of my desire for Dr. Joe would be. I slowly woke up after the anesthetic wore off. The first sentence the nurse said when she came to me was not to ask about my condition, but to ask, do you like Dr. Joe so much? I was stunned for a moment, and then shook my head reflexively. No, I said confidently. The nurse smiled and didn't continue the topic. After she left, my best friend who was standing by raised her phone in front of me and clicked on a video. Ah, Dr. Joe, marry me, Dr. Joe, you are my destined wife. I will grow 10 more appendices for you, the crazy woman lying on the bed in the video screamed. Her voice was loud enough to penetrate the 2 floors above and below, and Dr. Joe stood beside her, with her hands in her pockets, looking at me silently. I have heard that people who are not fully awake after general anesthesia surgery may talk nonsense, but I didn't expect to talk nonsense like this. I lay in bed. Petrified -2, I left the hospital late on the day I was discharged. It was already 9 o'clock in the evening when I left the hospital. I found out that I was being followed after I got off the subway. What's more unfortunate is that the street lights on the way home were broken recently. It was cold, and there was no one on the dark street. No matter how fast I walked, the footsteps always followed me closely. I was so scared that I was shaking a little, but I didn't dare to look back. I glanced at the alley ahead with my peripheral vision, and walked in with a determined heart. This alley is very winding, but I am very familiar with it, and I should be able to get rid of him in this way. After I walked into the alley, the man who followed me seemed to hesitate for a moment, but soon followed me in again. Suddenly, there was a crisp sound from behind, as if something of his had fallen to the ground. While he was looking for something, I dodged and hid behind the wall at the fork in the road ahead. The tall black shadow stood at the fork in the road and hesitated for a few seconds, then walked to the left. I quickly turned around and ran back, and just where he had dropped something, I saw a little reflection of metal. After returning home and locking the door, I sat on the ground against the door and panted loudly, and then I breathed a sigh of relief. My heart was beating fast, and at the same time I took out the thing I had just picked up from my pocket. It was a fountain pen. The cold fountain pen felt heavy in my hand, and it seemed to be silver-plated on the surface. And it looked extremely well made. Suddenly, I found a name engraved on the pen, and I took it in front of me and took a closer look. Joe Tsuchen. In the first second, I felt so familiar, and in the second second, I realized that it was Dr. Joe who performed the operation on me. 3. Are you uncomfortable after the operation? I can't eat fried chicken or drink iced milk tea. It's very uncomfortable. Joe Tsuchen paused with his hand holding the pen, then looked up and looked at me. His cold eyes collided with me through the lenses of his frameless glasses. Besides that? Nothing else. The air froze for 3 seconds, and then he nodded slightly at me. You can go now. His voice was clear and cold, like ice and snow melting in early spring in March. I sat there without moving. I have 2 questions for Dr. Joe. Ask. Why do you have to trouble Dr. Joe for such a small matter as appendicitis surgery? I went online to check Joe Tsuchen's information. He is a doctor of medicine who returned from a prestigious university. His theoretical and practical skills are top-notch. Most of the time, he takes over some operations that are extremely difficult and risky, which ordinary doctors cannot do. The appendix operation has nothing to do with him at all, but he even showed up here today to follow up for such a trivial operation. Joe Tsuchen was wearing a white coat, with a black signature pen in his chest pocket, and his face was normal. He opened his thin lips slightly and answered me lightly, the hospital is busy recently, and I also do something else. I nodded. Okay, then why did Dr. Joe follow me? I saw Joe Tsuchen was obviously stunned. Every night he wanders downstairs of my house, waits for me to go out at the breakfast shop outside my house after 7 o'clock in the morning, and even squats downstairs of my company during lunch break to get takeout. I stared at Joe Tsuchen, then took out the pen from my bag and put it on the table in front of him. Dr. Joe, what do you want to do? I really want to call the police. Joe Tsuchen's icy expression finally showed a ripple, and his eyes hidden under the glasses flickered for a moment, with an ambiguous meaning. After a long time, he seemed to have finally organized his words. Joe Tsuchen looked up at me and said to me very sincerely, I'm sick. Huh. The corners of my mouth twitched. Can you please describe the condition in detail, Dr. Joe? Addiction. I stepped back half a meter with my chair, and then looked at him in shock. You are taking drugs. Joe Tsuchen shook his head gently. No. I'm addicted to people, and that person is you. I'm most afraid of the air suddenly being quiet. I smacked my lips. I'm not very knowledgeable, and I've never heard of addiction to people. A difficult and complicated disease. Zhou Zichen sat opposite me, looking a little absent-minded, and really looked like a patient. I had no choice but to ask, then. Patient, when did this symptom start? How long has it lasted? Half a year ago. Since the first time I saw you in the hospital. I thought about it, and it seemed that I had come to this hospital once half a year ago. At that time, my best friend sprained her foot, and I accompanied her. But I didn't know Zhou Zichen at all at that time. So, you started following me since then, but I didn't notice it. Yes. Oh my god. I got goosebumps all over my body. This is really scary. Or don't worry about what he said. I'd better call the police first. I was touching my phone in my pocket, and Zhou Zichen suddenly said, I won't follow you anymore, but can you? I stopped and looked up at him. Can you, every day? He paused, then changed the subject, every 2 days, come to the hospital. I swallowed, come to the hospital. To meet you? Yes. I hesitated for a moment, then politely refused, why don't you treat the disease if you are sick? You see, drug addicts have to undergo compulsory drug rehabilitation, or you can. Zhou Zichen's face seemed to flash with a trace of urgency, and he refused without hesitation, I can't do it. Until my eyes moved down, he suddenly realized that he had just grabbed my wrist out of control. Sorry. When he took his hand back, there was surprise in his eyes. He seemed to be frightened by his reaction just now. I quickly got up and walked around Zhou Zichen. Dr. Zhou, if this happens again, we will meet at the police station. For it has been 2 days since I left the hospital since I saw Zhou Zichen that day. I have been extremely cautious these days, but his figure has indeed not appeared in my sight again. I was sitting with Hui Ying and having dinner when my phone screen suddenly lit up. My pupils trembled when I saw the name flashing on my phone. How come I have Zhou Zichen's contact information in my phone? Hui Ying rolled her eyes. You went crazy when the anesthetic effect didn't wear off that day. You shouted that you wanted to marry Dr. Zhou and forced him to give you WeChat. I almost choked to death on the food in my mouth. So, I took the initiative to ask for WeChat. What else? Hui Ying looked at me like a fool. With her beauty and status, could she still chase you for WeChat? I didn't say anything and looked down at the message. Zhou Zichen, can I see you today? I don't need to do anything, just let me take a look. His tone was sincere and pitiful, but I refused without hesitation. Sorry, no. After I replied, I clicked to delete the contact information. I don't believe that he can go crazy if he can't see me. Just as I was about to put down my phone, my mother called again. It was Uncle Joe's son who came back. My father and Uncle Joe have been friends for many years. My mother asked me to go to Uncle Joe's house for dinner the day after tomorrow. Uncle Joe's son is 4 years older than you. He just came back from abroad. He is capable and handsome. Hey, Yo Young, don't you like handsome guys the most? Let's go and see if it's suitable tomorrow. I sighed, and I knew it. I know, don't urge me, Mom. I don't want to fall in love yet. I am actually very familiar with Uncle Joe. When I was a child, I often went to their house to play because the dishes they cooked were very delicious. But I don't know the child in their family. I only know that he grew up abroad since he was a child. When I happily knocked on Uncle Joe's door with a box of roast goose, my smile froze on my face in just a second. Zhou Zichen stood in front of me, with the familiar indifference on his face. He was no longer wearing a white coat, but a shirt and trousers. He was probably helping with the cooking, and the cuffs of his shirt were slightly rolled up. Hello, Miss Yu Ying. Everyone was talking and laughing at the table, and my heart slowly calmed down from panic. Although Zhou Zichen was silent, he was very normal. He didn't eat much, but just took a sip of red wine from time to time. We also pretended to have just met, and the parents of both sides briefly introduced each other and chatted about family matters. I breathed a sigh of relief and started to eat seriously. It seemed that his disease was nothing more than that. When the meal was almost over, Uncle Joe suddenly mentioned that Zhou Zichen brought me some small gifts when he returned to China and asked me to pick them up. Zhou Zichen nodded and stood up. Seeing that he had no unusual expression, I followed him with confidence. His room was at the end of the corridor on the 2nd floor. I followed behind him, and he didn't say a word. Everything was normal until the bedroom door opened and he stepped aside to let me in. The curtains in the bedroom were drawn tightly, without a single gap. The moment the door closed, the world fell into darkness. Before I could ask where the light was, I was silenced by a nearly crazy kiss. He pressed me against the wall without any room to struggle, and his crazy, plundering kiss made it impossible for me to even whimper. He always looked so cold and indifferent on weekdays. I remember thinking when I was lying on the operating table, how beautiful it would be to hold a scalpel with those long, bony hands. But now those hands held me tightly in his arms, so hard that I could hardly breathe. You are a lunatic. I cursed him angrily in the gap between kisses. I'm sorry. He kept apologizing, but the thin and dense kisses fell on my chin and cheeks again. I'm sorry, I really can't control it. His voice was trembling slightly. The taste of the red wine he drank was still in my mouth, and I felt Zhou Zichen's hot body temperature through the thin shirt. 6. Can you stay with me? Be my assistant. You can. Don't think you can do whatever you want to me just because you've punched my appendix. I was leaning against the wall, panting like crazy, and cursing. He was silent for a moment, then asked me softly, "You can make requests, as long as I can satisfy them." I was so deprived of oxygen from his kiss that I started talking nonsense. "Okay, give me 5 million. Okay." I was stunned, then looked up at him. In the dark room, I couldn't see his expression clearly. His dark pupils were very close to me. He looked at my lips and tried to get close to me again. I quickly dodged to the side. "I said 5 million? Yeah, I heard it clearly." I swallowed. I always knew that Uncle Joe's family was rich, but I didn't know they were so rich. I, Yu Ying, have always been a person with clear goals. I can get along with anything except money. What do you want me to do? Let me make it clear first. If I had stayed by your side, would you not have behaved like crazy today? Sorry, I don't want to lie to you. To be honest, I can't guarantee it. The air became extremely quiet, and Zhou Sichen looked down at me, waiting for my decision. I stared at Zhou Sichen's face in the dark. His ups and downs were as perfect as sculptures. I suddenly had a strange idea. If he kissed me, it would not seem to be a loss. I would never admit that I wanted the 5 million. Ahem. I coughed, and Zhou Sichen immediately waited for my answer with full concentration. Well, it's not about money, it's mainly about being an assistant and learning medical knowledge. The night I agreed, 5 million was transferred to my card. I grinned with my big teeth, and asked my boss for annual leave overnight, becoming Zhou Sichen's temporary assistant. 7 today is the first day of work, the weather is fine, and I'm in a good mood. Of course, it has nothing to do with money. Only when I followed Zhou Sichen did I realize how busy he was. There were piles of cases, a constant stream of visiting doctors and patients, and meetings one after another. Zhou Sichen was standing in the corridor discussing surgery with a doctor. I couldn't even understand the messy professional terms and drug names. I only saw the doctor opposite asking a lot of questions, and then Zhou Sichen lowered his eyes to think for a moment and gave his suggestions. It looks a bit cool. But it has nothing to do with me. I was so happy to get 5 million last night that I couldn't sleep for most of the night. I got up early again today and yawned repeatedly while standing aside. The doctor had so many questions, one after another, my eyelids were fighting more and more, and finally I lost my balance while sleeping standing up, and fell forward. Zhou Sichen held the case in one hand and held me in the other hand. Before I could react, I was already leaning in Zhou Sichen's arms. I quickly stood up and apologized to them with an embarrassed smile. Sorry, my legs are numb, I can't stand steadily." My explanation was pale and weak. The doctor who was talking to Zhou Sichen across from me narrowed his eyes and looked at me for a moment, and suddenly hissed. "Dr. Zhou, your new assistant looks familiar to me. She looks a bit like the girl who said she wanted to marry you after the last appendectomy." "Ah, what appendectomy? I haven't had an appendectomy." "What is an appendectomy? You must have made a mistake." I smiled stiffly. Isn't it?" He stared at me for a long time, making my hair stand on end, and finally looked away. The first day of my assistant career, my reputation cannot be ruined here. I was roaring in my heart. When he left, my sleepiness was gone, but Zhou Sichen turned to look at me. I had 2 dark circles under my eyes, like a giant panda. "Did you stay up late last night?" Yeah. I nodded honestly. I looked at his schedule for today. He should have something else to do now, but he returned to the office. He sat down at his seat and began to look through the medical records on the table. "You should take a nap," he said. I was stunned for a moment, and suddenly realized that he changed the schedule to let me rest. Hey, this guy is not bad. When I woke up, I should follow Zhou Sichen to the group discussion. When I thought about how I was almost recognized by that doctor today, I began to back out. Sure enough, as soon as I appeared in their field of vision, a sharp-eyed doctor recognized me. Although I buried my head very low, they still cast doubtful eyes at me from time to time. No, I have to slip away. But as soon as I took a step back, I heard Zhou Sichen's voice. "Where are you going?" He lowered his head and wrote something, without even raising his head. "I went to the bathroom." "You just went there?" I was speechless. Hey, this assistant sister, why does she look so much like her? "I don't look like her. It's not me." Before she could finish, I denied it. Damn it, I was trying to cover up the truth. A trace of doubt flashed across everyone's faces, and the next second, the female doctor showed a strange smile. "No way, this sister is so powerful, she really chased Dr. Joe." No, we didn't. Let's discuss the next question." Just as I was in a hurry and didn't know where to start, Zhou Sichen interrupted our topic. For some reason, the doctors around me smiled more ambiguously. Since I can't avoid it, I'll just give up." I began to follow Zhou Sichen with my head held high, and admitted openly that I was the crazy girl who performed the appendectomy surgery. Being a follower around Zhou Sichen is a bit boring, but now, I have found something very interesting that can effectively relieve my boredom. At this moment, Zhou Sichen was in a meeting. He was standing on the stage explaining his surgical experience, and I was standing in the last row holding a notebook for show, winking at him. When he looked at me for the first time, I made a heart shape with my hands. When he looked at me for the second time, I blew him a kiss. When he looked at me for the third time, I said you are so handsome 3 times with my lips. Joe Suchin was obviously a little unstable. His speech speed began to increase, and his eyes swept towards me more and more frequently. Finally, Joe Suchin suddenly stopped talking. He lowered his head, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. My end. I laughed silently and wildly behind him, shaking with laughter. When Joe Suchin stepped down from the stage, he glanced at me lightly, and his eyes were extremely dangerous. Of course, I had already made all the preparations. When the meeting was over and I followed Joe Suchin back to the office, I even did some warm-up exercises just to run faster later. When Joe Suchin walked towards me, I ran towards the door as expected. When I rushed to the door, I found that the door was locked at some point, and my expression froze. I turned around and Joe Suchin approached me at a leisurely pace. The key that was just inserted in the door lock was gently put into the pocket of his white coat. Oh, I got it wrong. I laughed dryly and apologized quickly. Sorry, I didn't mean it during the meeting just now. I just wanted to. Well. His kiss this time was even more crazy, mixed with a strong sense of revenge. His right hand held the back of my head with irresistible force. I didn't struggle and let him do it. So when I secretly took the key out of his pocket, he didn't notice it at all. I found the right time to hide, picked up the key, opened the door and ran away. I didn't look back, nor did I see his expression. But he must have held a grudge, don't ask me how I know. Huiying laughed especially loudly when she learned that I was dominated by Joe Suchin. You've been with Joe Suchin for a day, it's like your soul has been sucked away, let me take you to have a good time. Huiying pulled me up, not giving me a chance to choose. In the KTV room, drunk Huiying fell asleep on the sofa. I was still 3 points sober, facing the group of wolves and tigers in front of me. Neurotic Huiying, she insisted on finding some handsome guy to accompany her for drinks. Now she is asleep, leaving me alone. Baby, you look even more beautiful when you are drunk. A man held a glass of wine and reached out to touch my face. Thank you, you are beautiful too. I waved perfunctorily and took the opportunity to open his hand. Sis is so pretty, many boys must like her. Right. A little brother who looked like he had just reached adulthood came over and looked at me with his innocent eyes like a little deer. Yes, it's really good. I gritted my teeth and glanced at Huiying. Drinking with her would definitely not be good. Don't hang around in front of me. She wants to order yours. Go find her. I pointed at Huiying, who was snoring on the sofa, and wanted to send them away quickly. It was tiring enough to deal with Joe Suchin during the day, and now there are so many. I spoke, but they didn't move. I suddenly realized that the little brother's eyes were always lingering on my hand. I looked down and saw the ring on my hand. It was an impulse purchase I immediately ran to buy after getting the money from Joe Suchin. The price was not cheap, but I didn't like it very much either. I glanced at him, and he looked up at me. I took off the ring on my hand without hesitation, and handed it to him. I'll give it to you. Don't bother me. A bright smile immediately appeared on his immature face, and then he thanked me repeatedly. The boy was wearing my ring on his hand, happily admiring the light, and Joe Suchin pushed the door in at this time. His appearance instantly made the private room fall into silence, leaving only Huiying snoring still loud. My brain paused for a moment, and then my first reaction was to think of an excuse, how to explain to him. Then the next second I reacted, I didn't have anything to explain to him, I was not his girlfriend. The boy who I just gave the ring to looked up at Joe Suchin with a puzzled look. Sister, did you order another drink with me? Hearing this, Joe Suchin's face became colder and colder. Ahem. I felt a little guilty for some reason. It was obviously nothing, but I had the illusion that I was caught as a scumbag. I waved to the 2 handsome guys, indicating that they could leave. But the younger brother was really a bit stupid. He waved his hands in front of me and said happily again, thank you for the gift, sister. You must come to me next time. I glanced at Joe Suchin from the corner of my eye, and I felt that the temperature of his eyes had dropped to the freezing point. I felt that I still had to explain. Well, my best friend likes this. She likes it every time she drinks. Before I finished speaking, Huiying suddenly snored loudly. That clearly meant that she was not interested in handsome guys at all. It really wasn't my order. I quibbled for the last time, just once. Well, yes, you also gave him a small gift. Joe Suchin's voice was faint, but extremely cold. I smacked my lips and looked back at Huiying again. At this moment, I really wanted to pick her up and beat her. 1-0 Joe Suchin drove here. We sent Huiying home first, and then it was time to send me. We hardly said a word along the way. I felt that I had done nothing wrong, so I ignored him. I was not his girlfriend, so I really gave him face. TSK. The car stopped downstairs of my house. I was about to leave when I found that Joe Suchin had also gotten out of the car. He came around and opened the passenger door. I looked at him hesitantly. I'm not that drunk. You don't have to send me off. I can get up by myself. Joe Suchin didn't say anything. The atmosphere was a bit stalemate, so I had to get out of the car obediently. I walked in front and he followed behind. When I arrived at the door of my house, I decided to say thank you. Thank you, Dr. Joe, for sending me back. Thank you for your help. I felt that I said it sincerely and politely. But for some reason, when he heard the words Dr. Joe and thank you for your help, he looked up at me for a second. If eyes could kill, I think I could die 100 times in that second. I was also confused. I had sent him off and thanked him, so why didn't he leave? We confronted each other at the door for a full minute. I saw that he had no intention of leaving, so I had to take the key to open the door. I walked into the house and he followed me in. I felt like I was a little drunk. I was a little confused and didn't know what I was saying. Joe Zuchen, are you satisfied? You have been following me for more than half a year, and finally you walked into my house. My house is not very good looking. It's not a wealthy family. Unlike you, you can easily take out 5 million. I'm really envious. Joe Zuchen handed me a cup of hot water. I was indeed a little thirsty, so I took it and drank a few gulps. I drank too fast, and the hot water accidentally flowed out, and my chin and collar were a little wet. Joe Zuchen came over, pulled a few pieces of paper, and wiped the watermarks on my face. I didn't bother to care. I felt dizzy, so I fell directly on the sofa. In a daze, I felt my body lighten, and Joe Zuchen had already picked me up by the waist. When I touched the soft bed, I curled up comfortably. He opened the quilt, covered me with it, and then carefully tucked the corners of the quilt. He seemed to stand in front of my bed for a long time until I muttered and asked, Joe Zuchen, is there a cure for your disease? Will you suddenly recover one day? I don't know. But as of now, it may not be. Oh. I said oh softly, and after a while, I continued the second half of the sentence unconsciously, that's good. I heard Joe Zuchen's footsteps suddenly stop when he was about to step out of my room. 11 The weather was getting colder and colder. When I wrapped myself in a thick down jacket and a scarf, it was almost the new year. Red lanterns were hung on the streets, and spring festival couplets began to sell well. A kind of joy that was unspoken but unanimous overflowed on everyone's face. This year, Uncle Joe invited us to spend New Year's Eve at his home, and we gladly agreed. This kind of lively atmosphere has always been the most heartwarming. And the busy Joe Zuchen can finally take a break now. Recently, the relationship between Joe Zuchen and I is a little subtle. The task of purchasing before the spring festival fell on Joe Zuchen and me, and I could see that Uncle Joe and Aunt Jiang were actually trying to bring me and Joe Zuchen together. Joe Zuchen didn't say anything, and I didn't express my opinion. Our subtle relationship was maintained like this. The supermarket was also full of red. I pushed the cart and slid quickly between the rows of shelves. Joe Zuchen took advantage of his long legs and followed me with big strides, and he didn't lose me at all. I stopped the cart in the potato chip area and looked around. Didn't you find the flavor you like? Joe Zuchen stopped beside me and turned to look at me. No, I shook my head, I like all of them, I don't know which one to take. Then take them all. I nodded slowly, as expected of Dr. Joe, you know how to choose. Joe Zuchen slightly curled his lips and smiled. My shopping cart was filled with potato chips, soda, and biscuits, and then I ran to the candy area. Seeing me excitedly choosing candy, Joe Zuchen said lightly, eating. Too much candy will cause toothache, you should. Forget it. If he had reasoned with me, I would not have listened at all, but now he suddenly stopped the topic, and I turned my head to look at him in confusion. Forget it? Why forget it? Why don't you continue talking? Joe Zuchen lowered his head and was silent for a long time. Anyway, you won't listen even if I tell you, and you will still be unhappy. I couldn't help but burst out laughing. This is not like Dr. Joe's style. He actually cares whether I am happy or not. While Joe Zuchen was waiting to pay, I ran out of the line in advance and waited in an open space opposite. There happened to be a mirror in front of me, so I happily admired my beauty. Today, I specially braided a cute hairstyle and tied 2 small balls on both sides of my head. The heating in the mall made my face red and looked particularly beautiful. Ah, today is also a day to fall for my beauty. Just as I was narcissistic, suddenly a man walked towards me. He directly turned on the screen of his mobile phone and said to me, "Beauty, add WeChat." I was stunned and secretly looked at him twice. His beard was unshaven, his eye mucus was not wiped, and he had a beer belly. Sorry. I smiled politely and refused. He seemed to find it a bit incredible. A flash of shock flashed across his face. And then he shook his QR code again. What do you mean, you won't add me? This time it was my turn to be stunned. Yes, don't you understand? How could you not add me? I'm actively giving you a chance. Do you know how many beauties are lining up to chase me? Don't be ungrateful. His voice was a little loud, and his incredible tone was mixed with anger at being rejected by me. Everyone's attention was attracted to him, and Joe Zuchen also looked at me nervously. I saw that he seemed to want to come over, so I made a stop gesture to him, indicating that he didn't need to care about me. I took a deep breath and started to output violently. Are you sick? I said no, I didn't. Don't you understand? How can a beautiful woman chase you when you are so sloppy and rude? Stop bragging. Why should I add you? What do I like about you? Your fat body, your yellow teeth, and your eye mucus. Don't embarrass yourself here, you ordinary man. He wanted to scold me, but the people queuing to pay the bills on the other side were already laughing. He looked around, blushed like Guangong, and turned away. I looked at Joe Zuchen proudly, showing him a smug expression, and Joe Zuchen also showed a helpless smile. Zhou Zuchen, don't you know how to quarrel with others? I asked him after I poked my head out of a big bag of snacks. Indeed. TSK. I shook my head regretfully. Dr. Zhou, your quality needs to be improved. The snacks we bought filled the trunk of the car. When I sat on the passenger seat, I was holding a bag of chocolate in my hand. I suddenly remembered that Zhou Zuchen tried to teach me to eat less sugar, so I turned around and handed the first piece of chocolate to Zhou Zuchen's mouth. He seemed to be stunned for a moment, then opened his mouth and took the chocolate I handed over. My cheeks suddenly became hot, and when I did this subconsciously, I didn't seem to realize the ambiguity. Forget it, we have kissed so many times anyway, what's wrong with feeding chocolate? I enlightened myself a few words, and then I ate chocolate happily again. But I found that Zhou Zuchen seemed to be in a particularly good mood that day. When Aunt Jian said she wanted to chat with me alone, I felt like there were 10 gong lingna singing tentative in my heart. She took me to the bedroom and asked me to sit down with a kind face. Yem, are you tired from work? Recently? No. Not too tired. I smiled nervously. I am your son's assistant, and I slack off every day. How can I bear the tiredness? It's good that I'm not tired. The more Aunt Jian laughed, the more uneasy I felt. Sure enough, she waved her hands. What are you talking about, Auntie? How can I compare with Dr. Zhou, who is so outstanding? What's the matter with whether I am worthy or not is even more far-fetched. Oh my god, it's really scary. I still know what I am like and what Zhou Zuchen is like. Aunt Jiao's words really made me feel embarrassed. When I came out of Aunt Jiao's room in fear, I saw my mother sitting on the sofa and talking to Zhou Zuchen. She was so passionate, and Zhou Zuchen was sitting next to her, listening carefully. I knew at a glance that things were not simple. When my mother was finally tired of talking, I sent Zhou Zuchen away and whispered to her. Mom, what were you talking about with Zhou Zuchen just now? It wasn't your 99 escapes of the domineering president's wife again, was it? My mother nodded happily, yes. How did you know? The corners of my mouth twitched, and I held my forehead in embarrassment. Xiao Zhou listened very seriously. Unlike you, you couldn't listen after I only talked about 2 chapters. My face was full of black lines. Zhou Zuchen, you worked hard. Today. 1-2, although I added him back on WeChat at Zhou Zuchen's request, we rarely contacted each other on WeChat. The reason was very simple, because most of the time I was tied to him and didn't need to contact him on WeChat at all. So when his message notification lit up on my phone, I was slightly surprised. I clicked the message unconsciously with a feeling of joy, and he said, my addiction is cured. My heart suddenly fell to the bottom. I looked at the screen, wrote and deleted in the input box, and didn't reply to the message for a long time. Is his disease cured? Suddenly a strong sense of uneasiness swept over me, and I realized that I seemed to like him. So when I started to get addicted, he was going to withdraw. Tears suddenly welled up in my eyes and began to fall continuously. I thought for a long time, and originally wanted to say, that's great. Then I changed it to, wow. Congratulations. Then I deleted it again and changed it to, really? Why so sudden? Then I found that I still couldn't act like I didn't care. It was too fake, I obviously cared a lot. I suddenly covered my head with the quilt and burst into tears. When the knock on the door suddenly sounded, it was already midnight. I was awake, but my eyes were red from crying. The sudden knock on the door scared me. At this time, my phone rang and I saw a message prompt. Zhou Zuchen, it's me. I opened the door, and Zhou Zuchen's breath mixed with a strong smell of alcohol rushed into my nose. Have you been drinking? I sniffed and asked. He didn't say anything, but hugged me tightly, and he hugged me very hard, just like he hadn't seen me for a long time before. Didn't you say your addiction has been cured? I clearly felt how much security this tight hug brought me, but I still said, why are you drunk in the middle of the night? Leave as soon as you are cured. He was silent for a long time, and then responded with a trembling voice, maybe it's cured, or maybe it's worse, don't chase me away. 13A plate of delicious braised fish was brought to me, and I swallowed my saliva. Zhou Zuchen was pouring me a drink, and the coconut milk poured into the cup made a gurgling sound. The New Year's Eve dinner on New Year's Eve was particularly lively this time. Aunt Zhao's meal was as delicious as always, and Aunt Jiang and Uncle Zhou kept picking up dishes for me. I almost didn't have time to talk, and was busy stuffing the dishes in the bowl into my mouth. When my drink was running low, Zhou Zuchen would pour it for me. With a braised lion's head in my mouth, I turned around and said to Zhou Zuchen vaguely, did you work at Haidilao before? Zhou Zuchen was stunned, then smiled. When I was full and sat on the chair rubbing my round belly, Zhou Zuchen suddenly leaned over and whispered to me, go upstairs, I have a gift for you. I stared at him and blinked, then replied in the same low voice, you said the same thing when you kissed me forcibly for the first time. Zhou Zuchen was stunned, and after a moment, a faint blush appeared on the tip of his ear. If you don't want a gift, forget it. I grabbed the sleeve of his coat, when did I say I didn't want it? I followed Zhou Zuchen upstairs, and he took out a very beautiful sapphire necklace from the box and gently tied it around my neck. So beautiful. I exclaimed unconsciously. That's good. I was worried that you wouldn't like it. There was a loud noise outside the window, and a bright light rose rapidly. The next second, bright fireworks bloomed in the night sky. Happy New Year, he said softly. My face was a little hot for some reason, and I stammered, I also have a gift for you. I took out a small folded note from my pocket and stuffed it into his pocket. Don't look at it now, you can only look at it after I leave. Tonight. I warned. Okay. He nodded obediently. The fireworks outside the window were so beautiful that I couldn't wait a moment and rushed to the rooftop. When I looked up, everything I saw was full of light and color. I looked up, put my hands together and closed my eyes. In the new year, I have many, many wishes. Wait. I suddenly remembered that I bought very beautiful fireworks that day and prepared to set them off tonight. Jo Tsuchen, wait for me. I'm going downstairs to get something. I ran downstairs with my fuzzy boots, and then I brought up a bunch of fireworks of all kinds. I picked one out and handed it to Jo Tsuchen. Hey, I'm a little afraid of fire, you do it. A spark lit up, and the flower-shaped firework began to rotate. Slowly, then faster and faster. The dazzling sparks flew everywhere, so gorgeous that I couldn't take my eyes off it. I suddenly remembered the scene in the movie, so I blurted out, if it snows, it will be more atmospheric. It's a pity that there is no snow in the south. Then let's go to the north to watch it together. If you like. I was stunned, and then looked up at Jo Tsuchen. I'm sorry, my self-control always fails when facing you. He said, I just read the note you gave me. My face was burning, and I didn't know what he was going to say next. He walked in front of me, and then reached out and gently touched my face. What I meant by saying that my addiction has been cured is that my morbid desire to get close to you has disappeared. I didn't know what he wanted to say, so I just nodded stupidly. But I found that after I recovered from the disease, my desire to be with you became stronger. Because I really like you, Yo-Yo. I like you very much, even more than that kind of morbid obsession. I suddenly smiled a big smile, but I wanted to hold it back, but when I heard him say that he liked me very much, I still couldn't control it. Yum, this disease must be the most worthwhile disease I have ever had in my life. If I didn't have this disease, I really don't know how a person like me who is so dull and boring can enter your life. I shook my head frantically. No, if you didn't have this disease, you would look down on me. Jo Tsuchen looked down at me, and I knew my face must be very red. It's just that the rooftop is a little cold, not for any other reason. He suddenly smiled. Very, very beautiful. Jo Tsuchen leaned over, gently pressed his lips against mine, and gently rolled over. The sound of fireworks continued to explode in my ears, and I secretly opened my eyes and looked at him obsessively. His eyelashes were long, and his expression was often so indifferent, like a beam of moonlight that only shone into my windowsill. On that note, I wrote a sentence from Chuck Palahniuk. A person who is addicted to me is addicted to each other. Jo Tsuchen gently embraced me in his arms, and for the first time, I took the initiative to hug him back. We kissed on the rooftop. The night was dark, and fireworks were everywhere. Extra birthday gift today is Jo Tsuchen's birthday, but I'm going to play a trick on him. When I walked into the office, he was looking down at his phone. When he saw me coming, he smiled slightly and put the phone aside. Jo Tsuchen just sent me a message saying that he would leave work early today. I glanced at his phone from the corner of my eye, and he seemed to be booking a restaurant. Dr. Joe, why do you have to leave work early today? I asked knowingly. Before he could answer, I continued, that's great. I'm going to a party with Huiying tonight. I deliberately looked at Jo Tsuchen's reaction. He was slightly startled when I said this. Is that so? He turned his head and looked at me with a gentle expression. Yes. I told Huiying the day before yesterday that the party tonight must be super lively. My face was full of passion, and I looked very expectant. Yes, that's really good. If you have to come back too late at night, remember to call me and I'll pick you up. I wish you have fun. Jo Tsuchen smiled and gently touched my head, and then I saw him turn off the screen of his phone without making a sound. I felt funny in my heart. I clearly forgot his birthday and was going to a party with my bestie, but he didn't say anything and asked me to have fun. Looking at his expressionless appearance, I decided to give him another blow to his wounded heart. I waved at him and said, then I'll go first. I won't bother you anymore. Goodbye, Dr. Joe. Sure enough, he sighed silently and said something he had said countless times, baby, don't call me Dr. Joe. Ha 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 ha. I really like bullying him. At 9 o'clock in the evening, I tiptoed out with a cake and gently opened the door. There was only dim light in the room. Jo Tsuchen was still sitting at the table reading a book. The room was quiet, and he was the only one alone. So pitiful, it's all my fault. Jo Tsuchen looked up when he heard the voice, and when he saw my figure, a hint of surprise flashed in his eyes. Yen, you're not. Jo Tsuchen, happy birthday. I held the cake in my hand and showed a bright smile on my face. Why are you still sitting in the room reading a book on your birthday? So pitiful. I couldn't help laughing as I spoke. Jo Tsuchen put down the pen in his hand and smiled helplessly. Yeah, it's so pitiful, because of whom? He walked towards me, held my face, and gave me a light kiss at the corner of my eye. Yen remembered my birthday, I'm so happy. He whispered in my ear. When I opened the cake, I suddenly had the urge to close the box again. The cake, which was already ugly by me, became even uglier after a bumpy ride on the road. I originally wanted to draw Joe Titchen and me on the cake, but as soon as I drew Joe Titchen and saw how ugly he looked, I decided not to draw myself. Let him be ugly alone. So when the cake was placed in front of both of us, we fell into silence at the same time. Is this made by Youngyeon herself? Joe Titchen stared at the cake for a moment. It looks good. Forget it, Joe Titchen, you are not good at saying such things against your will. I exposed him bluntly. If you really look like what I drew, I might not have asked you to do the surgery for me at that time. I wanted to insult him, but Joe Titchen chuckled. I didn't say anything against my will. I like everything Youngyeon makes. I suddenly looked up and looked at him with a very serious look. Joe Titchen, to be honest, if I really forgot your birthday today and went to play with Hoying, would you be angry? No, Joe Titchen smiled and shook his head. As long as Youngyeon is happy, nothing else matters. I listened to Joe Titchen's words and laughed from ear to ear. Joe Titchen, you look like a humble licker now. Really? Then be a licker. Looking at this ugly cake, I was too embarrassed to ask Joe Titchen to make a wish or blow out the candles, so I simply picked up the fork and took a bite. Then I said to Joe Titchen with shining eyes, try it. Although this cake is not good looking, it tastes very good. I also chose a great gift for you. I will show it to you later. Okay, you are not a licker, you are also my baby. While I was talking, I was busy eating the cake with my head down, and I didn't notice the fire burning in Joe Titchen's eyes. Seeing that he was still there, I urged him again, try it. Okay. Joe Titchen responded, and then gently hugged me from behind. He kissed the corner of my mouth, and the moist touch of the tip of his tongue passed over my lips, causing a tingling sensation on my body. Youngyeon, can you give me another gift? I was stunned and turned my head to look at him in confusion. His chin gently rested on my shoulder, and his long eyelashes trembled, casting tiny shadows under the weak candlelight. The moment I turned my head, our breaths intertwined, and the ambiguous atmosphere heated up rapidly. I seemed to suddenly understand what he meant. Well, how about? Oops. Joe Titchen suddenly frowned. I immediately looked at him nervously. What's wrong? My illness seems to have relapsed again. Ah. When he kissed me, his brows suddenly relaxed, and I saw the triumphant smile in his eyes. Oh, forget it, I am a magnanimous person. For the sake of his birthday, I will let him do it.